Hey, everybody. Good to see you. Good to see you all in Ipoh. Today, we are talking about failure. And it's really fun to talk about failure when we're looking at each other, right? Because if we're talking about something that we can keep hidden, probably be easier to be looking across at each other, but in some way to look at each other is to look at each other's failures. Because there's some things in our lives that we can't hide. Things that are obvious when we're singing in a room. And that is the beauty and difficulty, I think, of a community like this, where we have been together, many of us, for so long, and for so long have looked in this direction, and now we're looking at each other. And some of the awkwardness, I think, is simply just that. It's like, what are people seeing? What am I looking at? Maybe even how can they sing that song and with a clear conscience? And so we all just kind of come here with failure. Whether it's visible or invisible, we carry it in some way. And that's okay. It really is. And I know this because Jesus, when he spoke to the crowds, and in those crowds there would be people with tremendous senses of failure. Whether that failure was, I promised I was never going to lose my temper again, not just to the person in front of me, but also to God, and then I did. And now what do I do? Or I know something about that person, and I promised I wouldn't tell anybody, but then it's like right away, the first chance I did. I promised I wouldn't succumb to an addictive behavior. I promised I wouldn't cheat. I promised I would give 110%. And all these people around Jesus. And he looks at them knowing everything. So knowing way more about them than we think we know about each other as we look at each other and process. And he says this, "Fear not, little flock," which is really endearing. Fear not, little flock. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you, right where you're sitting and with whatever you're carrying, you the kingdom of God. Don't be scared, my precious ones. It delights God to give you goodness beyond your imagination. So when we come with failure and we roll out our little failure marbles, he comes in with this boulder of the kingdom and says, I will absorb that, I will transform that, I will change that. So, talking about failure, which is not terribly fun, but talking about it in the context of his grace and majesty, which is really fun. So let's together lean into talking about failure as we talk about how Jesus' scars can heal our wounds, that when Jesus comes to our failures, and he says, me too, which seems strange, but we'll get there. He doesn't just empathize with our failures, he can actually take us to a place of healing and victory. He turns our wounds into scars. To do this, we're going to look at Peter, one of Jesus' apostles who was the most prominent one and remains in our imaginations the big guy, so to speak. Peter has a terrible failing, and then he meets Jesus, and he has a conversation with Jesus, which is really helpful in this series. Because we've been imagining Jesus having conversations with these characters through the series. This time he actually does, which makes it way easier. We just get to read the conversation instead of imagine it. I'll tell you the story of Peter first, because you're probably going, how on earth does the sinless Son of God come to somebody who's struggling with failure and say, me too? Did Jesus fail? Well, let's tell the story first, and then we'll look in the scripture, because I think there's a place where Jesus and Peter can connect. The story, if you don't know it, is this. The disciples have been having a meal with Jesus, and Jesus hints at what's to come. There's going to be some kind of trouble coming his way. And Peter asserts himself and says, I will not deny you. These others may deny you, but I will stand by you to the end. I'd even die for you. And Jesus more or less says, you have no idea really what's coming. You're actually going to turn tail and run. You'll deny me 3 times. And Peter says, never. It's like 8 verses later, it happens exactly like that. Jesus is arrested. Peter's questioned, do you know him? No. Do you know him? No. Jesus denies Peter. And then Peter becomes broken like all of us do in the face of our failure. After the resurrection, Jesus meets Peter on the beach and has this restorative conversation with him, forgives him, and reinstates him. That's the story. And on the surface, it looks like it's just a story of failure, but I think there's something else going on there. I know there's something else going on there, and we're going to see it as we read the verses together. Let's start with these verses around the meal they're having together. This is before Peter has made the promises to Jesus that are going to lead to his failure. After supper, he, Jesus, took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." So this is where we get the ritual of communion from, is from reenacting this meal that Jesus gave to his followers. But here at this table, sitting among us as a friend, is the man who will betray me. So the tension in the room suddenly gets ramped up a little bit, because there's 12 of them there. So there's not a lot of anonymity. It's like, which one of you 12 or 11? So they're looking around. It's been determined that the Son of Man must die, but what sorrow awaits the one who betrays him? The disciples began to ask each other which of them would ever do such a thing. Makes sense. Is it you? Is it you? Who would? But it's funny what happens in this conversation about who the worst of them might be. It goes in the other direction, and they start to argue about who the best of them is. Look at the next couple verses. Then they began to argue among themselves about who'd be the greatest among them. And you can just see it happening, right? They're all like, well, it wouldn't be me, it wouldn't be me, because I'm actually this. Well, I'm actually this. And it just escalates, and pretty soon they're having this contest about who the greatest is. Jesus doesn't care for that sort of thing. So he tells them, in this world, the kings and the great men lord it over their people, yet they're called friends of the people. But among you it will be different. Those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leader should be like a servant. Who's more important, the one who sits at the table or the one who serves? The one who sits at the table, of course, but not here. For I'm among you as one who serves. You've stayed with me in my time of trial. And just as the Father has granted me a kingdom, I now grant you the right to eat and drink at my table in the kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Simon, Simon, this is addressing Peter here, but the word Simon is actually linked to the Hebrew word for listen. So some translations have, listen, Simon, Simon, listen, 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 Simon, Simon. He wants his attention. Listen, listen, Simon, Simon. Satan has asked to sift each of you like wheat. So just a second here, let's imagine who is probably the most vocal in this conversation about who's the greatest. Most likely the one who's getting addressed personally at the end of the conversation, right? You have a sense that maybe Peter won. Listen, listen, listen. Satan has asked to sift each of you like wheat. But I've pleaded in prayer for you, Simon, that your faith should not fail. So when you have repented and turned to me again, listen to that. That's a prediction of the denial. When you feel really bad about what you're going to do that you haven't done yet, this thing you're about to promise me that you're not going to do, when you feel really bad, and when you repent, turn back to me again and then strengthen your brothers. Peter said, Lord, I'm ready to go to prison with you and even to die with you. Now, what Jesus says here is exactly the kind of thing that we might think but not say when we've just had somebody who's argued vehemently about how important they are promise to die for us. There'd be a disconnect. Peter is suddenly going, I. Oh, no, yeah, no, Jesus, you. And Jesus knows, that Peter's whole worldview is oriented around Peter's self-preservation. Peter getting what he needs. And until that changes, he's not going to be able to do anything but deny Jesus in crunch time. Jesus, knowing this, is more or less saying, Peter, it's actually going to be impossible for you. But he puts it this way, and it's almost comforting, given what he said before. I know what's going to happen. Peter, let me tell you something. Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And it happens. Peter, fundamentally oriented around himself, does not love Jesus enough to stand by him. So here's where the me too happens. Because we can't say, Peter in a moment of failure has Jesus come along and say, I know what it is to fail too, Peter. I wanted to heal that guy's blind eyes, and I made a mess of it. I put the mud in and the spit, and what was I thinking? I should have just gone, eyes gone. Jesus doesn't have that sense of failure. But I do think, as a human being, he fights with what we all fight with, the sense of self-preservation, the sense of our need to protect ourselves, to love ourselves, to care for ourselves, the sense that we're the most important people in the world, and if we're not looking out for ourselves, who is? The next section in Luke, before the denial, actually, Jesus is praying, and we see a bit of the struggle. He's praying with the disciples about what's to come. He talks to them for a while. Then he walks away, stones throw away, which depends on who's throwing the stone, I suppose. Could be like 4 feet or really far. Kneels down and he prays. Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me. This is a struggle for self-preservation, the human desire to not have to go through pain. There's another way that this can happen. Yet, I want your will to be done, not mine. In the face of the desire to avoid pain and preserve himself, he submits because he loves the Father more than he loves himself. Peter cannot do the right thing. Peter fails because Peter loves himself more than he loves Jesus. The wound here that's being addressed is not failure. The wound is self-love. The wound is loving yourself more than you love Jesus. And I would suggest that most of the failures in your life, most of the failures in my life, they come because of that. We love ourselves more than we love Jesus. When you love yourself more than you love the people you're in relationship with, it shows. How many of you have ever heard things like this in the relationship you're in? You say you love me, but you never help out around the place. You say you love me, but you never take me anywhere. You say you love me, but we never spend time together. You say you love me, but you don't listen to me. And so we need to correct ourselves and say, you know what, honey, I'm sorry, I said it wrong. I do love you, just not as much as I love myself. Cue the uncomfortable chuckles. Because it is 100% true. When you love somebody, you do the things they want to do. You go where they are. You get to know them by that proximity. You serve them. So the honest answer for Jesus, or for us with Jesus, often in the places of our failure, is, I do love you, Jesus, just not as much as I love me. And in that place is where the wounds happen. This is what's going on for Peter. This is what's going on for us. And this is where Jesus meets Peter and says, in that moment of self-preservation, I was ever able to love the Father more than me, and so I didn't screw it up. It's really telling when you have this idea in your head that it's a love issue to pay attention to what Jesus says to Peter when they meet on the beach after Jesus comes back to life. They meet on the beach. Look what Jesus says in John. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? This is their first conversation after Peter's colossal screw-up. One of the versions of the story of his screw-up actually has them making eye contact in the moment of his greatest denial. Jesus does not come to him and say, what were you thinking? You're going to have to do better. Because he knows that it's not the failure that's the issue. He doesn't need a new strategy. He doesn't need to memorize more scripture so that in that moment of temptation he can recite a psalm and know that he's going to be saved. Jesus knows that the root issue that's causing these failures in Peter is because Peter loves Peter more than Peter loves Jesus. And he goes right to it. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied. You know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeats the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know I love you. Then take care of my sheep. A third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter's hurt this time because it's a parallel of the 3 times denying him, right? It's sort of a poke a little bit. 3 times denial, 3 times confession of his love for Jesus. Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my sheep. In this conversation with Peter, Jesus is showing Peter both the direction to go for healing, loving Jesus, intimacy with Jesus, and the path for how to get there. So he's not just saying, love me more, love me more, love me more, leaving Peter going, how? He's saying, love me more, and the way that you do that, not the way that you prove that. The way that you do that is you love my sheep. Jesus here, in a sense, saying to Peter, if you love me, if you want to get to know me better, if you want to have my heart, then spend time with me. To spend time with me is going to mean going where I hang out. And Jesus is everywhere that lambs are being fed. Jesus is everywhere that sheep are being fed. And when you do that with Jesus, you enjoy the company of Jesus and you fall in love with Jesus. Some of you are ready when and if Jesus were to say, do you love me? And you were to say, yeah. You would have faces of sheep in your mind. Faces of lambs. And it would not be, see, Jesus, I do love you because look who I'm serving. Tick, 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 tick. No, it wouldn't be that. It would be the swelling inside of you of the intimacy that's happened with you, the love that you have with Jesus when you're with him serving the sheep. So you don't so much see Jesus' face, you see his face in the face of the people you're serving. So let me ask you, when you say, I love you, Jesus, do you see the faces of lambs? Do they roll through your mind one by one of the struggling, vulnerable, new Christians that you have embraced and invited in? Of the places that you're sacrificing for them so that they can be included? Of the warmth, receptivity that you're giving to them? Do those people come to your mind as you say, yes, Jesus, I love you? And he says, I know you feed my lambs all the time. Or does he say to you like he would say to Peter, really gently, well then, feed my lambs and let's get to know each other a little bit. You cannot say you love Jesus and never do the things he likes doing. You've had that conversations many of times with people in your life. You say you love me, but you never do the stuff I like doing. And eventually Jesus is like, you know what, I'm over here. If you want to know me, I'm over here. I'm feeding lambs. Now there's a nuance here that's interesting to me. Perhaps some of us are going, you know what, I tried that. I served and I invested and I just ended up burnt out. I got fried and my margins were just full. It was just a mess. A couple things there that might help you process that. One is, what was your motivation? Was it obligation? I got to do my part too, I suppose. Well, I do make more money than most, so I should probably give more than most. Oh, that's going to get you real close to Jesus. You're doing things to score points instead of because you love somebody, and that never works because that's still about you. I'm going to do a great job of the dishes and empty the dishwasher so that Tamara won't be frustrated with me. Or I'm going to do that because I love Jesus. It's a different way that settles in a person's heart. One has me feel close to him. One has me resent that I have to be good to get what I want. Your failures are rooted in this simple truth, mine too. Every time we love ourselves more than we love Jesus, we fail, and then we miss him. The other thing is, sometimes we think that we're feeding the sheep, And we're actually just teasing the sheep. We're teasing them by what we could give them if we actually cared enough to feed them. So we might sign up to do something, say it's kids' church. And so we walk in and there's a group of grade 3 people, just kind of like little birds, mouths open. But they haven't been prayed for by name. They haven't had somebody prepare to be there with them. It's just somebody taking their turn every third week. And so the sheep are not being fed. The sheep are being teased by how they could be fed if the person came in with some food for them. Do you see the difference? There's a house church that has some new immature sheep in it. And it feels pretty good because we're one of the house churches that is open. We got some people in it that are new and tough and challenging. We still only go every second week. And when we do, we haven't prepared and we haven't prayed for them. You're not feeding the sheep. You're teasing them. And where the sheep are being teased, you won't find Jesus. So Jesus is calling you to intimacy, not so the two of you can sit by the pen and go, hee, try it. Oh, no, not for you. Hee, no, not for you. Hung, hung, hung. Jesus is not there. And you don't want to be there very long either because something hard happens inside of you and it's very frustrating for the sheep. You want to be with Jesus, prioritizing the feeding of his lambs. And every step, tentatively, you take in that direction. You say, I don't know how to make 3-year-olds happy. I want to give them my best. Google it. There's answers for people who really want to feed sheep. You Google how to be a fantastic usher. Enter. You'll have plenty of stuff there. It's not difficult in practice when your heart is consumed in love with Jesus. But he calls you to that place. Not so he can get stuff out of you, but so he can get you. You prioritizing him, you loving him, you and him, decade after decade, feeding the sheep and being so tight together. Now, I was telling my daughter Acacia about this particular part of the sermon. I was like, I probably am not going to be able to end there, honey. It's a little heavy. She's like, no, do it. And no, we won't, because see, the point is loving Jesus. And we can love his brilliance here and how he set it up, that the things that we do that are good for other people are the things that connect us to him. Like, we can appreciate that brilliance. That's amazing. But there's more reasons to love him. It's because of how it feels to be Peter in that moment. After that exchange, is Peter more filled with love towards Jesus or less? So much more. I was trying to think of something in my life that was remotely like this, and I have something that made me feel like I think Peter felt in a smaller way, has some of these same themes in it. I think I was 19 or 20. I went out to visit my buddy Dave out in Calgary, and we go in a 1988 red and blue Firefly, just like the ultimate mountain vehicle, 3 cylinders. We're puttering through the foothills, and we get to where we're going to hike. And 2 prairie boys, it's like there's no point. A hike shouldn't be a walk. A hike should be an adventure. So there's these hikes called scrambles, where it's basically like this, and it's all shale, and you just crawl on all fours. And it gets narrow and sketchy, and there's cliffs, and it's just an awesome adventure. So we're scrambling up there all the way, and we get to the top, and you know what happens when 2 guys that are 19 and 20 are at the top of a hill, and it's about time to go down. It's time for a race. It's going to be a long race. Dave is better with endurance than me. Dave and I used to be super competitive all the time. We're not anymore because I just beat him too consistently. So we don't actually compete anymore. But back then it was still on. And I know that he can run farther than me, but I know I can run faster than him. And it's probably about 5 kilometers back. Probably less. It's all downhill. Anyway, we start going and going and going. And I'm like, if I can get in front of him, it's too narrow to pass, and I can just block him. And then when we get close enough to the car, I'll sprint and leave him in the dust, and that's that. So I'm bobbing and weaving and keeping him behind me for a good chunk of it, and then he makes a move around me, and I realize, unless I do something here, I'm going to be toast. So, without a thought of Dave love in me, and a lot of self-love, I reach out with my hand, grab his shirt, give it a yank, because I'm going to pull him like this, and I'm going to run in front of him and reestablish myself in front. As I do that, I hit a root, and we're flying. And I refuse to let go. I take him down with me, and he falls on my hand like this, kind of like on his hip. And we slide, I don't know how far, but it's like the length of 20 cheese graters, let's say, on the bottom of my hand. And so I have a scar there. A scar inflicted along the same lines of caring for yourself and feeling kind of sheepish. I was trying to get myself ahead in the process. I almost hurt him, and I sure messed myself up. Bottom of the path, there's this mountain stream. I've got my hand dangling in it. And it was so, like, just ribbons hanging off there. And I just wanted to sleep, just irrationally. I was like, I want to sleep. It's probably a warning sign of some sort, but that's what we did. So I go into his house, and I crawl into bed, and I got my arm up like this. There's like some Burger King napkins on it with tape, right? We're not doing this very well. And I fell asleep, fitfully in and out. I wake up, and there's Dave, 20 years old. He's gone to the drugstore. He spent about $40, which when you're making $6.50 an hour, is like he's invested a whole day in this. He's got some tape, some gauze, some salve for my hand, and a little fancy scissors he bought. And he gives it to me, and I fumble around with it for a while. And then, like a weird, awkward, but really precious moment of a 19-year-old and a 20-year-old, he's like, just let me take your hand. And he binds my wounds. Now, having been such a jerk, having thrown his safety out the window and having broken myself on my own self-interest, it's an incredibly gracious move at any age. And he wraps it up, and you don't think about this when you're 20, but man, did I ever love him more after that than before? And he's a pretty good friend before. So how that made me feel, I think, is a little bit how it feels when we come to Jesus with our failures, and we're like, I have hurt me, and in the process, I kind of tried to hurt you, and I don't know where to go. And he just says, give me your hand. And then he binds our wounds as we move towards the lambs. Here's an image for you. The licking of a lamb's tongue on your wound is medicinal. That's all for today, Nipawin. Thanks for joining us. Let's stand and let's sing together.